but to separate out current from past, the legacy versus current.
That I'm even less certain is always the case. I guess in my experience, I guess I would wrap it up to say that certainly there are instances where that could happen, and you're going to have every groundwater, aquifer, surface land application scenario, you're going to have to vet on its own particular circumstances and merit that applying that as a general rule becomes problematic. And I don't even, you get into preferred flow pathways and stuff like that, and you're not sure whose water you're picking up. It could have been a couple miles down the road, but you're thinking it's the neighbor. There's a lot of really complicated things that raise questions when you get into that, and so I'm less comfortable with that. Certainly, I think there's circumstances where it's been shown, possibly already, in some of the enforcement actions the regional board's taken. They've made that assertion based on the data they saw. I did not review that data. I can't really chime in on that. So, but I'm less comfortable with saying that for sure.
Well, as an assumption, is there anything in the way it's written that would enable or prohibit the executive officer from requiring it if they wanted it in a given case? I mean, just a question of what we're saying in a statewide order.
Well,
So require the executive officer to require the sampling.
If they
The
felt
two.
there was a reason
No.
they wanted it.
Yeah,
or
I don't
they
think
needed
so.
it in a given case.
The requirement is to do one of three, one of which is direct sampling, and then to look for seasonal variation, et cetera, to find a sample that is at its highest. I don't think there's anything in that particular language that prevents the executive officer from saying.
Right,
There
just
could be.
because we're giving discretion, so someone has to submit the sampling pattern. So if
Right.
there's an arena or an area where the executive officer thinks they really do need two,
I think it's setting the minimum standard, but the
It's a
executive
minimum
officer
standard.
yeah, I believe
could
so.
could say that 2 is needed in a particular case.
On this topic, I'm struggling.
as soon as we
I'm
keep by talking.
I'm struggling with this a bit because I didn't see this coming. I thought and I didn't see it in comments. Maybe I missed it. But is this something? This was just a staff-driven refinement to take out the spring fall, and then replace it with the more site-specific approach. Because I'm actually kind of swayed by the environmental representatives' input on this. Keep it simple. There's wet, dry, and you might be able to pick up what Fran talked about. I was thinking more of seasonal fluctuation, because there'll be some, as has been stated in the record, there are some sites that have shown some responsiveness to agricultural practices. It's not universal. So, I'm wondering why we changed it, and why we really need to, because there is a certain simplicity to it, and we will get a certain amount of there will be certainty to what to expect based on a simple spring fall requirement. So this one kind of caught me off guard a little bit.
So I'll actually let Darren follow up with his answer, but if we say 2 initial sampling rounds, 1 spring, 1 fall, instead of direct sampling, then for any well that is actually where a sample is taken, a program designing a study will have to go to that well twice. I don't know that that's necessarily an impediment to designing a study, but I think we were trying to simplify it and just say, 1 sample is fine as long as you're catching the highest value.
And we're focused more on the public health thing, that you want to make sure you have the worst case, not thinking
Yeah,
about what the arguments made today.
Right, Chair Marcus. I mean, that's kind of what we were thinking was, it's certainly simpler. Well, it has certain amount to say, once you know you're in this zone, I want to test from that well. And then we really thought then, because we're going to require annual sampling when you're above 36, you're going to weed out the low ones, and you're going to now focus on just the high ones. And not only are they going to get 2 samples, they're going to get sampled every year to monitor them, since they're kind of in that threat zone that could get there. So that was our thinking. It's certainly not perfect, and could go back to 2 samples. Either schema works.
Well, and on this, I'll just say I could live with it either way, but I slightly favor the existing language, because it's not just incorporating seasonal fluctuations, but also other variables like what Darren was talking about. So if you have an area where, kind of getting back to the irrigation method that we were talking about, if an area is just, for whatever reason, they're on sprinklers and they've got several crops that they're growing back to back, then I think it probably would be good to leave it up to the program to develop a system where they can catch the worst case possible. And in that instance, maybe it has to do with irrigation timing. It may have more to do with that than it does, seasonal fluctuation.
And just to confirm that it's the characterization work that's going to go on to differentiate between as to what is legacy and what is more current in terms of irrigation or nitrate application practices.
Well, I think that is one of their goals, to see if they can draw those connections.
Right. That's the.
Whether that'll.
That's one of the. Yeah, one of the.
It's a bit tricky, so it'll be interesting to see their results, I guess. We've done some work here at the state board as well, trying to characterize nitrogen sources, and if it's a clear signal, you can see it. If it's mingled, it's very hard to discern, and so it's tough work to do with some of that really advanced stuff and aging. And the aging things, there's a lot of characterizations that'll possibly show some different results that, yeah.
But if I can, just to be clear, that's not something that's required by the order. That's just what we heard was one of their own objectives to assign responsibility and causation.
Where I was going is I was trying to figure out, when is the issue of legacy going to be addressed, and the only place I could see or could imagine was in the characterization component, acknowledging that it may not be clear.
Right. And so even to follow on Phil, I mean, most of our minimum standards or whatever we put in the order to confine the characterization have all been really focused on the protection of drinking water. And so we did not talk about the other objectives associated with that, but to make sure that whatever characterization they do has these minimum standards associated, so that we can do notification above 45 and the testing between 22 and 45 and so on, to try to make sure we address that most immediate concern.
Well, let's talk a little bit. I'm trying to figure out how to order these in a way. I know we need to talk about the Groundwater Coalition opener, but let's talk dates a little bit. There were a couple of concerns about the dates we had that might actually give people an extra 12 months or an extra 7 months to do things, and you had a fix. Can we talk about that for a minute? Because obviously our intention here was to prioritize drinking water.
So there are, I think, 2 areas where we should be talking about dates, at least. The first is the concern that the Central Coast Board raised. It's on page 34. It is, this concern is contingent upon whether the board wants to allow new groups to apply. But in the area where we added the 2 dates, November 1st, 2013, at the bottom of the page 34 of the red line, blue line strikeout, I think they made a good point, frankly, and something that we inadvertently did, which is the very last line of that paragraph says the discharger shall have 1 year to comply with the provisions identified in Part 2. Well, we didn't say 1 year from when. And so now with the change above, the implication is it's 1 year from November 1, 2013. That certainly was not our intent. We could fix that, again, if the board wants to keep the November 1, 2013 opportunity for new groups to apply. We could fix that fairly simply, I think, by where, again, in that line, discharger shall have 1 year. We would insert the words from the adoption of this order, and then continue with the existing words to comply with the provisions identified in Part 2. That restores the 1 year time frame back to 1 year from the adoption date of the order. That time is clearly passed, so this would not give people more time where they don't have an approved groundwater, a group groundwater monitoring to start their individual groundwater monitoring. Again, up to the board's pleasure.
But have they already, what I heard someone say is people who aren't in a coalition have already done it or started to do it.
That's what they should have been doing under the terms of the order. This would essentially make that provision exactly the same as what it is now. It's just that because we changed the earlier parts of that sentence, we need to add to the end of the sentence.
But with respect to a new group coming in?
So if a new group comes in, again, this is
Right.
a big policy call for the board. If the board didn't want to have new groups have the opportunity to apply, we just wouldn't make any of the changes that we had proposed in that paragraph. We would remove the 2 November 1, 2013 dates and leave it as it is. There's already a footnote that says that the regional board would have to reevaluate previously approved group proposals to make sure that they're consistent with the order. I don't think we would need to make any other changes for that to happen. So once the board decides whether you want to allow new groups to apply, we'll know what change to recommend.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, on that point, my notes from the Central Coast Water Board's input was they had a suggestion to modify the first of those two sentences, but put in previously approved. And then, so keep the November 1st date, but their suggestion was then to strike the second sentence.
You know, frankly, that change would make sense if the board ultimately decides not to allow new groups to apply. Either that change or no change makes sense. I don't think we need to do exactly what they're proposing because there already is the footnote, as I mentioned, that requires the regional board to go back and reevaluate previously approved.
Okay. Okay. So that's that's another way to accomplish what they were asking us to consider.
That's right.
Okay.
All right, I know we're going to have to come back to the groundwater, whether we're going to reopen it, but I want to move, that's just a big one. I want to move to the annual compliance form
Right.
issue, and I'm sure we'll hear about it in the rebuttal as well, so I'm not suggesting that we decide it, we're not going to decide it till we're done, and I'm not totally sure what I think. So what I heard, it is, I'm just sitting back, sorry, thank you. What? I know, I just have to get closer to it. That's what she's saying. It's hard to remember to stay close to it. So as I understood the conversation, so the way ours would read, or what the solution would be, is that the annual compliance form as it exists would be due October 1st, as everyone was told, but we would require the high-risk, the high-risk assessment by December 1st so that we stay on their schedule versus a redo of the whole form.
Right, and so you will want to hear from the parties about this, but
Frame the question for them to respond to in the rebuttal.
sure, actually, I think you just did it. But but essentially, you're right. The Central Coast Board is concerned that by using the exact same annual compliance form as is currently in place, they will not get the information that's required in provision 68, which is on page 45 of the strikeout version. That provision 68 requires Tier 2 and Tier 3 dischargers to report their nitrate loading risk factor and their overall nitrate loading risk level by December 1st, 2013. So the reason that they are concerned about that no longer applying is because the change that we had proposed on page 63, I believe it is. On page 63, really, since the reporting requirement for provision 68 is the annual compliance form, and we said we just use the existing annual compliance form, their concern is that they just wouldn't get that information.
Right.
So there are other provisions, other requirements in the annual compliance form that have future dates for submission. Not everything is due with each annual compliance form. And so one way to resolve this would be to, here on page 63, make it clear that they shall use the existing annual compliance form for the next submission, except that that form should be modified to include a future date for the provision 68 nitrate loading risk factors and nitrate loading risk level. We can do that, I think, fairly simply. It's just that they would change one of the modules in the annual compliance form to have that future date apply. Again, you'll want to hear from the growers about this and from the regional board about whether this would actually work mechanically. But essentially, the growers would be submitting their annual compliance form on October 1st. It would follow the format that has been in place for the last year. There would be an updated version and one module that would have to be submitted December 1st or thereabouts to include just the provision 68.
So they wouldn't have to refile their entire form.
Exactly.
All right, so people can talk to, including the Central Coast, on the logistics of that or options for submission. All right, that's
Yeah,
helpful.
I mean, my reading of it is that has to be reported electronically or as the EO determines, or in the compliance form on December 1st. So, you know, how you figure out the mechanics of that is, you know, I'm interested in knowing, but they're not getting away from having to report it if you implement the order as drafted. Yeah, it's here. It's plain language. It says annual compliance form.
Yeah, no, the problem is it does say it has to be reported. It has said that now at least since August 20th. I think I said June. It was actually August 20th is when we changed the deadline to December 1st. But Central Coast Board's point is, well, if the mechanism for reporting it is the annual compliance form, and we're saying use the same annual compliance form that doesn't have that requirement, we should clarify it one way or another.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
I read it. I'm not confused, actually. I think it's a nitpicky point.
It's nitpicky.
No, Steve, actually, no, it's important no, this, the point that I get is that the current October 1st old former application or compliance form did not have the nitrogen loading risk factor and did not have the nitrogen loading risk level. And so if they're already using the current one and have sent it in,
Right.
how do they
Right.
add that piece? And so you're saying that's not confusing?
You make it. Well, anyway, it's. I think it's easy to work out. Okay. And I think the language. I mean, we can clarify till the, you know, till the end of days, and that's fine. But, you know, I'd like to move on.
Do you have, next point, I mean, do you feel comfortable in terms of figuring out how to deal with the odd lease arrangement issue and notification? There was a discussion that seemed it was doable, but I don't know that we arrived at an actual proposal yet on just how to be realistic but make sure people get notification quickly and what the regional board should do, how we figure that out. I'm just trying to figure out, and maybe I'm overly worrying about it, how to make sure we don't have more notifications on his desk, then we need to have,
Sure. So
have to give.
first, I think it probably would be useful to hear from the regional board when they do
Okay,
come back
that
up
would be
about
good.
what their process is currently and what they would expect to do in the future. My view is that by saying in the regional board's order, and this is what we're proposing to amend, is the regional board's order itself that says the regional board will do something that really is future-looking. It doesn't actually impose an obligation on somebody, on a discharger under the order. If in fact, because the discharger includes both the owner and the operator, frankly, my expectation, subject to confirmation by the regional board, is that if they get the 24-hour notice that a well is above the MCL, and along with that, if they're informed that we're not allowed, we, the grower, aren't allowed to contact the tenants, then their order would be probably directed to the landowner, whether it's an absentee landowner or not. But again, I don't know that any language is necessary to change, because again, it's prospective. It says this is what the regional board will do. They will require the discharger, which again is a joint obligation, the owner and the operator. I frankly would be very surprised if the regional board ever expected to do any kind of enforcement where a grower said, I'm actually not allowed to contact the tenants by the terms of my lease. I would expect that they would look for compliance by the landowner in that circumstance.
All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit more when it comes. So let's talk a little bit about the issue of the new groundwater coalition being allowed. I've been a fan of that, thinking we spent all this time, we've reestablished some standards, and so it just seemed logical to me to give a short window of time for folks to go back in who might want to do it. Now that we've defined it, they might not want to do that. The regional board and many of the stakeholders feel that that's going to delay things for a long time. I definitely don't want it to delay drinking water work by much, but I'm open to being convinced of the opposite, which is not to open it if it's going to be that complicated. But I'm curious as to what my colleagues think about that, because it just, to me, just seemed logical if we're making a decision and we're changing or establishing the new rules that you would let, I thought was a very short window open to see if anybody wanted to go through it. And then I know the region thinks that's really hard, but they'd be evaluating I don't know, maybe there'd be a lot more, I'm not sure. I haven't had a sense of it being a flood of work, but just being of a piece with the other work. But I'm curious as to what people think, and I would like people to respond to it with more granularity than in the opening.
This is the one area that I feel pretty strongly about. I think the rest, we can work it out. On this one, I do think we should leave it open. I concur with the concerns that the EJ community and regional board brought up about not wanting to have a delay for the program that's already in place. So my question would be, can we structure language in such a way so that we allow for the opener and the existing program still goes forward? In other words, just sort of, some rolling way to join in, rolling or another date to add on.
You mean
'Cause
that
this-
they could join an existing program that's being reworked as opposed to creating a whole new one?
Well, really, we're talking about regional, so these contour maps and any statistical sampling that's going to go on, that's that evaluation and the one-year period, or, the necessity to move forward quickly, that evaluation would remain in place, I would think. So we're talking,
Yeah.
maybe I'm confusing this. I'm talking about other areas outside, because the existing, hypothetically, an existing region that might be out there, there already is a deadline in place. So my desire is to have other areas have the opportunity to join in a coalition.
I think there are two issues that the Central Coast Board is raising, and they can speak to whether I've got this right or not. But one is the question of the programs that have been approved. They've got a time schedule, and they don't want to have that extended by us setting a new deadline.
Right.
I think the second issue is that in there's a sequence of things that happen with this growers signing up for cooperative groundwater monitoring. Within 3 months of the adoption in March of 2012, they were supposed to indicate their intent. Within a year of that, a groundwater monitoring proposal was supposed to be considered by the executive officer. And if one didn't get approved, then the dischargers had a year to implement individual groundwater monitoring. And I think one of the things I heard from Angela was that because some of these programs did not get approved, there's now individual groundwater monitoring in place in some of these areas, because I think we're about 3 or 4 months past when the deadline for approval was. So I believe they're trying to both protect any time frame that's in place for the cooperative groundwater monitoring programs that have been approved, and also not backtrack on any individual groundwater monitoring that's going on already in areas where a program was not approved. So I think I would maybe want a little bit more clarification from them if we're understanding it, and why they think that setting a new deadline for areas where maybe there is individual groundwater monitoring now may not work, well, may not meet their purposes of just having that individual groundwater monitoring continue.
Okay. Good. So we'll hear about that in rebuttal as well. And then there was one other. The issue of sampling when it's over 45 continuously. The issue, I'm sorry, maybe I'm just tired, so I'm leaning back. The issue of sampling if it's high. I'm trying to think of if there are options for dealing with that have, if somebody's so high that the system won't work, that might be something that you would, from a public health standpoint, want people to know. So,
and they have a second point, and I think Darren can address that, but if I'm hearing it correctly, I think the concern is that if we stop at 45, we're not capturing wells that have a, you know, as they increase, would maybe now, because they look lower than they otherwise would be, are pulling the statistical projections or characterization for the area down. Does that make sense?
that's a different issue. But
It's a different issue. There's the issue of point of use devices and whether or not those are available, and you want some certainty in knowing the MCL for that purpose. And I think I understand the second issue to be just skewing the statistics because you think a well is at 45 and you stop sampling, whereas it continues to increase. And I know Darren has thought about that and has an explanation.
Yeah, so on that second one, that's not how the statistics work. It's not like a bulk average where if you have a bunch of numbers and you start adding low numbers, of course you're dragging the average down. So the statistical methods that are used for determining the characterization are based on a point. And what ultimately would happen is within that zone of 22 to 45, where you have more data points now because of this extra monitoring, it allows you to draw your lines better between those zones, but really has little influence outside of them because it's a point-to-point statistic rather than the mass of the whole. So when you're doing your contours, you're really looking at, you know, when you're in a particular point in place, you're looking at the 4 pieces of information you have around it, not what's over 5 points away. If I kept you.
well, no, it just seems to me that for it to be a good characterization, you're going to need specific numbers, right? So you're going to if you're looking at the thing, it's like, let's say it's 45 and we don't test again for a year, but somewhere in the water monitoring plan, again, I haven't looked at any of them, to characterize it, you're going to have to take some of that stuff into account. And if you hit a well or you hit an area that's going to be really high, then that's going to deal with your contour map's going to be, that's going to tell you something different than if you have something that's lower, right?
Yes, but I'm not sure how that relates to the other point. You lost me on your stretch. Sorry.
Well, I guess that's because we're talking about a different thing.
There's the
I
two
was
different
talking about.
components, right?
They're two
certainly.
different components. So
The component of will the detail testing that we're basically requiring from 22 to 45 skew the results of other areas that are over? And I think that my answer to that is no. That the way the statistics work is that once it's over 45 and above, all these low samples that are between 22 and 45 over in this other area of the map are not going to change your representation of where it's high. It's going to rely on the data in that area. It's very area dependent.
Right.
The other answer of, you know, how fine do you want to get it, you know, above 45 is a result of how much testing you do, certainly, and that is a valid question of, you know, how, once it's over 45, how bad do you want to know it is, and there are judgments you can place on that.
Well, yeah, but we're not suggesting, unless I totally missed this, that when they test, the scale only goes to 45.
No, I believe that there will be some capped value, though. So I would expect that, you know, since we've set the numbers at 22 and 45, that they would do something like 22.5, a 45, possibly a 90 and above, and not necessarily go higher. But that, they certainly could add higher lines as they deem it important. I mean, and that's, I think, something that the regional board is expected to review when they get a submittal saying, okay, here's our map, and they're like, okay, but you show this whole half at, you know, exactly above 90. What's that mean? Is it something? And so there would be some back and forth as far as approval of that characterization that, you know, that the regional board would expect and could work out what's important and what's not.
Well, so that's the way I read it, that a lot is relying on the regional board's discretion and how they approve whatever the characterization plan is and the results. And I was just presuming that you wouldn't say if there's a value, if you have a problem where the system doesn't work over 120 and you've got an extremely high value, that's something you do want to know in terms of notifying people. So whether it's, some suggested that you would test it every year is one thing. I'm thinking, how do you make sure you're flagging those areas where it's so high that not only do you need to notify people not to drink it, but that you need to be notifying them that the point of view systems aren't going to work.
Sure. And that could
That
be,
just seems an important public health thing. So the question is, how do you make sure that the executive officer has the ability to make that judgment?
I get what you're saying. Yes, and so we could talk about possibly adding language in that directs that, you know, characterization up to 120 or something like that, so that that's one of the lines and above.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Think about that, and then we'll
Right.
hear what people say. All right. Other issues that people want to toss into the mix before we break? We're not done, but
Yeah, you know, I touched on the issue of the new language, the basis for, you know, the agricultural decision for application of a certain load of nitrogen. One thing I didn't hear back from staff was that addresses the intent of the nitrogen balancing goal. Okay, I didn't hear that from you. That's what I wanted to hear. If it's not true, then tell me that. But what we're getting at for the audience is we're recognizing the value of knowledge. You know, what was the decision about that underlay the application of nitrogen, and gets at the issue of the balancing ratio that everyone keeps commenting on. And this is based on the discussion we had with the regional board staff. This gets the regional board the information they need to track that type of performance. And that's my understanding, but I want that, I'm going to get it out there, because we're not avoiding that issue by putting this language in.
Right.
Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I concur with your statement, and that will lead to that type of understanding that will allow you to interpret the nitrogen information we're having them report and move forward and provide information, I think, for the ag community as well as to what kind of decision, what people are basing decisions on as a whole, and where we can improve and not approve our efforts in that way.
And if that's true, then yes, we are setting up everyone, the public, the regional board, the agricultural community, to be able to track progress. And, you know, that's the intent.
okay. 15-minute break, and then we'll go to rebuttal. Thank you.
Oh, no, you can get them like that sportscasters, the big ones with the big bowl thing. I don't know, I can't remember the name of it. All right.
I can think of other scenarios that it could be taken. It's like, yeah, I think so we are different. I'm not confident that water monitoring is good to
We'll reconvene in a couple of minutes.